then you come to the case of ancient Egypt. One of the things Eliade points out, which I think is really interesting, I mean, really phenomenal. The story I'm going to tell you right now was essentially revealed in Egyptian culture at the dawn of the culture rather than developing over the course of the culture. So the Egyptians had a revelation right immediately that the most fundamental of gods was the one who created as a consequence of his tongue and his speech, very much akin to the Sumerian idea with regards to Marduk and also to later Judeo-Christian ideas. So here's the story. There's 4 players in this drama, okay? There's Osiris, his wife Isis, Horus, their son, and Seth. And Seth is Osiris' evil brother. Okay, now Osiris was a remarkable guy. He was the founder of the Egyptian state from the mythological perspective. So kind of like Romulus and Remus for Rome, or like George Washington for the US, right? A mythologized figure who represented all of the pharaohs and people, for that matter, who'd actually constructed the Egyptian state. Osiris, father of Egypt, so to speak. But Osiris is kind of old and a little archaic and maybe a little bit senile, and even possibly a little bit naive in that, you know, even no matter how great you were in your youth, as time goes on, you lose contact with environmental transformations, and the old rules that you live by are not necessarily applicable to the present, and some of those things that you ignore become paramount in importance. And it turns out that Osiris has an evil brother, Seth, and Seth eventually turns into Satan as mythology develops through the centuries. And Seth is a nasty guy, right? I mean, what he wants more than anything is undeserved dominion over the Egyptian state. Now Osiris, because he's not paying attention and because he isn't sufficiently cognizant anymore of the power of evil, more or less ignores his evil brother, who in turn chops him into pieces and then distributes his pieces all over the Egyptian state. Now, you might say, well, why didn't he just kill him, right? I mean, you'd think chopping him up would kill him, but he's a god. You can't just kill him. The reason in mythology, and you see this in movies as well, where the villain never quite dies, or the hero never quite dies, is because even if you eliminate individual embodiments of what those figures represent, new embodiments manifest themselves virtually immediately. So one of the things mythology is quite clear about is that you never win a final battle with evil. It's a permanent property of the world. So, anyways, Seth hacks up Osiris, spreads him all over the land. Osiris ends up living a kind of shadowy and nebulous ghost-like existence down in the underworld, and Seth becomes the ruler of the state. A nasty story. All right, but Osiris has Isis as a wife. Now, Isis had a huge cult. She was a powerful goddess of the underworld. A kind of combination of Kelly and Diana, so to speak. Capable of tremendous destructive power, but also the source of all good things. Something very much like Tiamat. Now Isis got wind of her husband's disintegration, so to speak, and she went searching around Egypt till she found his phallus. And with it she makes herself pregnant. Okay, so what does that mean exactly? It means something like this. The collapse of any great order brings with it new potential. And I think this is something that capitalism has way over forms of government like communism. Capitalism has mechanisms in place to allow large structures that are no longer meeting their function to collapse. But frequently when they collapse, it's not like they disintegrate into dust, right? They disintegrate into subcomponents, so to speak, many of which then come to terms with the fact that the order has collapsed and build something new. So you can't get rid of culture so easily. You can hack it up into bits, you can disembody it, so to speak, you can spread it all over the state, you can introduce chaos into it, but that's something that has the potential of new birth, like the phoenix rising from the ashes. So anyways, Isis, who's the matrix, who's Tiamat, gets Osiris's phallus, which is the container of the germ of culture, right? The phenomena that's capable of the seminal idea, and she makes herself pregnant. And she gives birth to Horus, who's the long-lost son of the rightful king, right? A very typical mythological motif. Okay, so Horus is alienated from the kingdom, which is another very common mythological motif. You know, like how King Arthur, for example, is raised by commoners. This same story pops up in the story of Christ, for example, because Christ has heavenly parents, but then he also has his kind of ordinary parents, and it's a very common motif. Anyway, so Horus grows up outside of the classical structure of the Egyptian state, which is tilted terribly towards evil because Seth is dominated, because Osiris was too blind to his evil brother to take appropriate defensive actions, and he grows to maturity. And then he decides, like all rightful sons of the long-lost king, to reclaim his heritage. So he goes back to Egypt, right? And he has this vicious battle with Seth. And in the process, Seth tears out one of his eyes. Well, fine, and that's an indication of just exactly how devastating a battle with the forces of evil, so to speak, precisely are. They represent a critical threat to the integrity of consciousness, right? That's why he loses an eye. Well, luckily enough, Horus has got his act together, and he does defeat Seth, and he banishes him, and he gets the eye back. And then you think, okay, great. Pop the eye back in, become emperor, everything's fine. Now, let's backtrack a little bit and think about this politically. Now, the Egyptians had this really weird idea. They had the idea that the living pharaoh was the living pharaoh and the dead pharaoh at the same time. That makes no sense rationally, but it makes a lot of sense from a narrative perspective, because what they were saying is something like this. Look, you got to think that when you become king, or when you become president, or when you take on a role of that absolute magnitude, that then you're partly you, but you're also partly this role, and there's really no way out of that, right? And the role is composed of the unbelievable weight of the cultural tradition that you're representing. And you can say, well, that's true for being king or for being president, but it's also true if you become a doctor or a lawyer or any sort of specialized occupation. It's partly you, because you're embodying the role, but it's partly the role too. So the pharaoh is the live pharaoh and the dead pharaoh, because the dead pharaoh represents culture, right? The king is dead, long live the king. Okay. But paralleling that idea was the idea that the pharaoh was not only the dead pharaoh and the live pharaoh at the same time, but that he was Osiris and Horus at the same time. But then you think in the story, Horus has taken over Seth, he's got his eye back, he can be king. But he isn't king yet. And this is where the Egyptians really get their act together. And I think of the two stories that I'm telling you, this is the one that has the most significance, I think, for modern people, because we're so likely to sidestep our obligation to our culture, whatever that happens to be. So instead of popping this eye back in his head, which is the first thing you'd think he does, he decides he's going to go back to the underworld, where Osiris is living in this ghost-like and dead manner since he's been chopped up by Seth. So he goes down into the underworld, which is no piece of cake, and he finds Osiris there in this kind of half-dead state, and he gives him his eye. And that enlightens Osiris, right? It gives him vision. And so then he takes Osiris back to Egypt, arm in arm, so to speak, and it's the conjunction of Osiris and Horus that constitutes the basis for Egyptian sovereignty. And that is bloody brilliant, right? Because the Egyptians figured out that, so Horus is Marduk for all intents and purposes, right? He's this avenging hero. In the Egyptian story, he fights political corruption rather than chaos, but you can understand that those are two flip sides of the hero archetype. They are. The hero archetype has two basic elements. One is the confrontation of the terrible aspect of nature, chaos in its most brutal form, and the other is the confrontation with the archaic aspect of culture. And in some ways those aren't distinguishable, because if culture isn't archaic, chaos never makes itself present. So, which is to say, you can't separate out political degradation from environmental degradation, say. It's the same idea. So anyways, Horus has this great idea. He needs his father, right? And I told you about the same motif emerging in Pinocchio. We already looked at that, right? Pinocchio doesn't become genuine until he risks his life saving his father. All right, so the same thing is happening in this particular situation. So that's pretty cool. So then you get this situation where the Egyptians characterize sovereignty as the capability to overcome evil in the political domain, combined with, and that's a youthful capability, right? Combined with the wisdom of the past. All right, then you look at that from a political perspective and you find out already that the Egyptians viewed the pharaoh as the live pharaoh and the dead pharaoh simultaneously. But then you find out something else that's interesting, and it gives you some real insight into just exactly how bloody powerful these ideas were. So you think, what did the Egyptians do with their spare time? And then you think, well, they built the pyramids, right? I mean, and that was no trivial undertaking. It was sort of the 5000 BC equivalent of flying to Mars. And I mean, the pyramids are pretty impressive now, but they were a hell of a lot more impressive in their original form because they were in the middle of an immense complex. And the pyramids were dedicated to the immortality of the pharaoh. And the pharaoh was possessed by a spirit called Ka. And Ka was his immortal spirit, and it was the union of Horus and Osiris. Okay, so Egyptian society was dedicated to deifying the immortal spirit of the pharaoh, the union of Horus and Osiris. And it was this union that gave it was this identification with this union that gave the pharaoh a phenomenon the Egyptians called Mat. And Mat was like truth or good order. And you could think about it as conscience in a sense, as if the pharaoh was utilizing the union of Horus and Osiris, then he would have an intuitive ability to decide what the appropriate course of order was. And so the Egyptians would say, for example, when the pharaoh came into the court, they'd say, the sun has risen, and by that they meant that the power that reigned over the dominion of the night had arrived. They conceptualized Mat as the capacity to put order in the place of chaos, essentially formally. So they assimilated the union of Horus and Osiris with the capability of putting order in the face of chaos. They regarded that as immortal, and they spent all of the excess resources of their society glorifying that idea. And you think, you don't produce something like the pyramids without really being possessed by an idea, right? This is no trivial undertaking. It's going over a period of several hundred, if not several thousand years. It takes an awful lot of work. So this idea of the immortality of the union of Horus and Osiris and its association with sovereignty was an absolutely potent idea for the Egyptians. It gave their whole culture motive force. Okay, so the Egyptians thought, Pharaoh's immortal, and that's the reason why, and we more or less partake in his immortality by being his subjects, so that was a pretty good deal. But then Eliade points out something very interesting, and this is called the democratization of Osiris. And what you found was that initially there were certain symbolic representations representing the immortality of the pharaoh that could only be used by the pharaoh. But as Egyptian culture continued to develop, then the symbolic representations of immortality started to be adopted by the aristocracy. Now, what did that mean? It meant that this process that the Egyptians had conceptualized as integral to the order of the state was no longer solely embodied in the hands of the pharaoh, right? It had started to drift down the power hierarchy into the aristocracy. Okay. Well, then you think, what happens after that? So by the end of Egyptian society, the aristocrats were characterized by an identity with the union of Horus and Osiris, right? Sovereignty had started to spread itself out. Then you think, what starts to happen with the Greeks, right? The Greeks attribute sovereignty to every male Greek. Barbarians, no. Women, no. But at least all males, right? You get a beginning of a democratic notion there. The Jews developing ideas that, if not derived from Egypt, were at least similar in structure to Egyptian ideas, say, not the aristocracy, not the pharaoh, but every individual has the capacity of establishing a direct relationship with the form of the deity, right? Then you have a Christian revolution that follows that, where the idea that sovereignty inheres in the individual is distributed to everyone, right? Everyone. Male, female, criminal, non-criminal, murderer, rapist, taxman, you name it. Sovereignty inheres within them, and it's on that soil that our whole democratic culture emerges. These unbelievably archaic ideas first acted out, right? First embodied in ritual, first dramatized, then only told as stories, developing more and more coherence over stretches of time of thousands of years, not hundreds of years, but thousands of years, becoming more coherent, becoming more pointed, becoming more relevant with regards to their embodiment, then starting to become understood explicitly and distributed through the entire society.